me get situated here. I'm sitting on pillows. Hello, friends. So today I thought that we would do something fun and talk about 5 horror films that you did not know began as books. Now, I don't know you. Maybe you did know all of these were books before they were novels, but I am stupid. I read a lot, and I've always been a reader. In high school, I was very much so obsessed with Chuck Palahniuk and Stephen King. Before that, I read a lot of Stephen King in like junior high school and elementary school is when I started reading Stephen King books. In fact, the first Stephen King book I read was this, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and that's why it is beaten to shit, because it's old as hell. Just like me. So I've always read books, but I've never really read horror movies that began as books. And so this year I was like, you know what? I'm gonna do that. So I started Googling, and I found a list of really general horror films that began as books that I really had no idea started as books. So even if you did know every single one of these, even if you've read them, if you haven't read them, whatever, stick around, because I'm going to be talking about the differences and similarities between the books and the films. And not only that, but I'm not going to talk about which is better, because books and films are two completely different mediums and I don't want to discredit either. So I'm not going to be talking about which one's better, but I am just going to be talking about things I liked and didn't like from both types. So here we go. All right. First, let me get my phone because... Sorry. I just made that noise and jumped at my cat. She's not that thrilled about it. First off, we begin our journey in Amity Island. That's right, my friends. Our first book is Jaws. Peter Benchley's Jaws. This was written in 1974. And I don't know if you can tell, but my cat has eaten this. Jaws. Pause. This book is really interesting. The coolest part, I feel like, about this book was at the end, well, a lot of different things. It had like brainstorms of his ideas for the novel, the name of the novel. It had conversations between him and I believe a producer that was making Jaws. I really liked this because he had a lot of conversations and a lot of writerly questions in here. He would talk about why Brody all of a sudden gets in a boat. Like, what are his stakes? How come he's terrified of the water and then all of a sudden he goes in the water? Now, obviously I don't know how much they changed with his notes, but it seems like in the film that his son almost getting attacked by a shark was his like motivation for really going and being like, no, this bitch is gonna die. It also said that since boyhood, Peter Benchley, sorry my cat, had nurtured a fascination with sharks, their elegance of design, their mystique, their prehistoric simplicity of their threatening nature. And I thought that was a really interesting, I really liked how they talked about just his fascination with sharks, why he wrote the book. So he knows a lot about sharks, which is why the novel, I think, talks about, I mean, it's not like super scientific, but it does describe the anatomy of a shark, and that I really, really enjoyed about the book. Reading about somebody getting eaten by a shark is quite terrifying, but then I just actually watched Jaws, and watching somebody get eaten by a shark is equally as terrifying. So I think that the gore factor and the horror in both the book and the movie are both fantastic. Okay, so there are big differences between the book and the movie, particularly with Hooper's character. So the Hooper in the book is very arrogant. He's like him and Brody kind of have like this, you know, they butt heads throughout. Brody's very jealous of him. I don't want to I don't know how much to talk about because I don't want to give too much away if you haven't read this, but there are definitely reasons why they go at it. And in the movie, Hooper's not arrogant at all. I mean, he does come from a rich family, but he seems pretty humble and he's funny, and I really like his character in the movie. And it's interesting because in here writes, God, he's an inconsistent character about Hooper. He also writes that he's an insufferable, pedantic little schmuck, and which I thought was really interesting because I love Hooper in the movie. I don't particularly like Hooper in the book. He also talked about how the idea of a rogue shark is absurd and it wouldn't happen. He also wrote, if you present this shark as a wild, girdling maniac responsible for nearly every recorded shark attack death, you destroy one of the central horrors of the story, namely that a shark doesn't have to be deranged to eat people. Eating people is normal, instinctual behavior for great whites. There is profound terror in the normalcy of killing, which I thought was, quite interesting. But I can, I see why they did go with the idea of a rogue shark in the film. Without that, a lot of the elements of the movie would be lost, and they had to explain away some reasons why the shark was like jumping on a boat and eating people. I love both of these. I will say that because Brody and Hooper are so different in the book, they don't have that camaraderie, they don't have that respect for each other. I really did enjoy that in the film. Not to say that I like the film better, I like both of them a lot, but they are very different pieces of art. I also love Quint in the movie. I love him. He's such a lunatic. I think he's so fun. And he's similar. He's like that in the book, but again, that like camaraderie, that mutual respect I think is missing. And instead of going on the boat and bonding over killing the shark, I feel like they're going for their separate battles. But I really do like the mutual respect that they have for each other in the movie. And when Quint dies in the book, you're like, oh, that sucks. And then when he dies in the movie, you're like, oh, dude, that was sick, but like, oh, I liked you a lot. All in all, I'm really glad that I read both of these. Or I read this and watched the movie. Quite a lot of differences and similarities in both of them, but they're both really great, and I recommend reading that one. So next up, we are going to talk about, let's get this one out of the way. Okay, so this is Era 11, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Era 11's Rosemary's Baby. And again, look at my cat chewed on this one. Oh, she's such a little shit. This one I really don't have much to say. It is pretty much the book reincarnated. Really not much is different. I really couldn't find too much that differed from the movie. Both fantastic, both phenomenal. I really suggest reading this one. It's really good. But as far as the movie and the book go, they go hand in hand. They are both beautifully done, beautifully written, beautifully directed. I love both of them, and I'm really glad that I read this one as well. I'm sorry I didn't really have much to say about that one. They're both really great. Okay, let's move on. So our third film of the day is Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs. Now, before I talk about this one, I would just like to say it's interesting because the order in which these were written were Red Dragon, Silence of the Lamb, Hannibal, and then Hannibal Rising. So Red Dragon is actually the first book in the series. It was published in '81, but it's the third film that was done. So I thought that was really interesting. Just a little fun fact. In fact, I think I have Red Dragon. So I just bought Red Dragon to read because I loved this book so much. Like I was just saying, it's really interesting how a book is written and it's so well done that they just pull straight from the book and put it into the movie, and a lot of that was like this. There are some differences within the film and the book. So obviously I haven't read Red Dragon, so I don't know how much of Hannibal Lecter is described in that book. There was a short description of him in The Silence of the Lambs that didn't match the movie, of course, because you can't, that's impossible to do. But the description of Hannibal was different. He was like ambidextrous, he had 6 fingers, he had a metallic rasp in his voice, which I thought was an interesting description. Okay, so yeah, so the description of Hannibal Lecter was quite different than the book. Sorry, my cat's eating. The description of his cell was different. I feel like the movie version made a little bit more sense, at least in the movie, you know what I mean? Whereas I'm pretty sure in this he had more of a bars on his cell, if I'm not mistaken. So that one made him seem more isolated, made him seem more dangerous. So I did like that. We also got a little bit more on the emotional side. You know when you're reading a book and it's omnipotent and you can see different perspectives and kind of get the feeling of different people. So we got that a lot in this book with Clarice. We do get more of an emotional side of Clarice, which is interesting because I feel like in the movie we do get to know a bit of her personal life as it's relayed to Hannibal Lecter, but it's not necessarily her feelings. It's not her nervousness, her anxiety, her fears. And I feel like we get to delve into that a little bit deeper with the book. We got it a little bit with James Gum, which was pretty cool. And also with, so we hear about Jack Crawford's wife, Bella, who's sick, she's dying. That gives him an emotional perspective that we don't get in the film. So I thought that was interesting as well. Apart from that, a lot of it was quite similar. A lot of the scenes directly out of the book. Some of them are a little mixed around, some of them are new, different, but for the most part, a lot of it was quite similar. This book was fantastic. It kept me on the edge of my seat even though I knew it was going to happen. Really good. Highly recommend this if you haven't seen it. If you like Silence of the Lambs, you're going to love it. And I'm really excited to read Red Dragon next. Oh, one thing. Clarice actually ends up with Noble Pilcher. So she actually ends up with Pilcher in the book, which is one of the men that work at the museum that she goes that identifies the Death's Head Moth. So I thought that was kind of cool too. The endings are a little bit different in the film and the book as far as the description of what happens to Hannibal Lecter, but still great, still both great, both thumbs up, fantastic on both ends, and definitely read this one. Okay, next up we have I Know What You Did Last Summer. Wow, so many differences between the film and the book. In fact, let's just preface this by reading something. Oh, by the way, this is by Lois Duncan, I Know What You Did Last Summer, published in '78. So let's read what she had to say about it. She said, for one thing, this book was written, this movie was a shock to me. For one thing, this book was written in '73, and I had almost forgotten I'd written it, so it was very exciting to learn that it was going to be a major motion picture. I could hardly wait to see it. I went to the theaters, bought my ticket and popcorn, and found a seat. Then onto the screen came an insane fisherman carrying an ice hook. He wasn't in my book. I thought, you know, this is a bit complex, maybe I've walked into the wrong theater, so I was preparing to leave when no. Up from below rolled the words, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and I thought, this is my book, but who is that man? And what is he going to do with that ice hook? Well, I soon found out. He's going to decapitate my characters. So I don't know if you've read this book, but it is much different than I Know What You Did Last Summer, the film. It is not a horror novel in any sense. If anything, I would label it more as a drama. I don't want to give it away and I don't want to say what the differences are because they are the main difference in the book. Like, instead of killing a fisherman, something else big happens, and it is much more dramatic and heart-rendering than, not to say that killing a fisherman isn't sad, but it's different than the book, you know? It's not a fisherman coming back to avenge his killers. It's not that at all. That's what happens, right? Is that who the killer is? It's been a while since I've watched it. This book is not a horror film, and in fact, Lois Duncan even states in the back, there's like a little Q&A, which is interesting to read as well, where she talks about how she doesn't write horror films, so she was quite horrified to find out that her book was turned into a horror film. She was like, these are my characters, this is not my story. So this one was probably the furthest from the movie. Also, another this is so weird, so strange. This book was written in '73, it says. When you're reading it, it's talking about text messages and laptops, and I was so confused. I was like, was this not written in '73? And I guess the writer went back and modernized it, and that just totally threw me for a loop. I thought that was kind of weird. But other than that, that's about it. Now on to possibly my favorite of the books that I read. The fifth book that I read was The Exorcist. So this is William Peter Blatty. This is The Exorcist, and this was published in, I believe, the 70s as well. 71. Okay, this book, holy shit, was terrifying. Okay, so I picked up this book and I was like, okay, I'm gonna read The Exorcist. I've seen the movie. Movie still kind of gets to me sometimes, but you know, as you grow up and you watch it 30 or 500 times, you're like, okay, I can deal with this now. I just watched it again like last week, I think, and it fucked with me a little bit, but it didn't like give me nightmares or anything. I pick up this book and I begin to read it, and the first day I read it, I go to sleep and I have a nightmare, and I'm sitting in my nightmare, I'm sitting on the edge of my bed and I'm putting on my shoes, and from behind me I hear this guttural growling, and it's obvious, it's evident that whoever is doing it is sitting on the bed behind me, and I slowly feel hands grip my shoulders and I wake up sweating. I was so terrified. So that was my first day with The Exorcist, and I was only on page probably like 60 at that point. So needless to say, this book freaked me out. It says the most terrifying novel ever written, and it quite possibly could be. Now, there are a lot of similarities, however, there are a lot of differences as well between the movie and the book. So I wanted to dive into those. For one thing, let's talk about the similarities. Characters are the same, you know, the setting's the same. We still have the mom who's an actress, the daughter who becomes ill, that sort of thing. The differences, however, so the book takes on more of a psychological stance, I feel like, than the movie does. So we have our priest Damien, who's also a psychologist, and he, in the book, is struggling really hard with his faith. He's struggling really hard with the idea of trying to believe that an exorcism needs to take place. Now, don't get me wrong, he's a bit hesitant in the movie as well, but once the exorcism begins, it seems quite clear that he believes it. In the book, he goes back and forth for a while. A big portion of the book is him going and finding evidence to stand up to the fact that this girl is possessed. And in the book, a lot of these are disregarded. And so he's having a really hard time believing that she really is possessed. And so I thought that was like an interesting thing as well. Okay, one thing I will say is that in the book, I feel like the demon does speak more and it's more conversational, whereas in the movie, it's quite short sentences, quite short phrases that are spoken. My cat is purring and rubbing against me. Do you finally love me? Oh, sorry, where was I? The demon speaks more. So I'm usually under the impression that if you have a antagonist, cat hair, if you have an antagonist in a movie, if they speak less, it's usually creepier. For example, The Strangers, like I'm just gonna give a random example off the top of my head. The Strangers, the second The Strangers Pray at Night, the bad people, I don't know why I'm quoting that, they are bad, they murder everybody. The killers speak quite a lot and it makes it less creepy. Whereas in the first one, they don't speak. They speak rarely. I think they say like, you were home, is Tamara home? Short sentences like that. And that makes it so much creepier, in my opinion. Whereas in The Exorcist, I feel like the demon speaks a lot more, yet it's still creepy. Now this is kind of the interesting point, is I was thinking, if I didn't have the vision in my head of Regan from the film, would I be as creeped out? So that is an interesting thing to consider. I still think I would, but did I picture Regan the entire time? Yeah, I did. And it was quite chilling. Nightmares for days. But a lot of the events are the same. A lot of the people who die get killed in the same way. The ending's the same, you know, quite similar. But this book was fantastic. But here are the books. They are all great in their own ways. And if you haven't read any of these, I really suggest you do. And if you have read them, what did you think of them? Which ones have you read? And which one was your favorite? I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again on Sunday. Goodbye.